everyone and welcome to video tutorial 16. You should now know all about the nervous system and you should be able to pause the video and fill out the table before I go over the answers. So, the answers are that the brain controls and coordinates all nerve impulses. The spinal cord relays impulses between nerves and brains. It controls reflexes. The sensory nerves carry impulses towards the CNS from muscles and body organs. The motor nerves carry impulses away from the CNS towards the muscle and body organs. So if you've managed to answer all these correctly, well done. But if you've struggled to get the answers correct, then remember you can go back and watch the video or parts of the video that you were struggling with as many times as you want to. Today we're going to be moving on to reflex actions, which is a key part of key area 2. If you want the worksheets to go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to 2 multicellular, 2 control and communication, 2 consumable and activities, and 2.1 nervous system. PowerPoint is found in PowerPoint and is also called 2.1b nervous system reflex action. So today we're going to be learning about the reflex action. Our learning intention is to learn the 3 parts of the reflex action and to be able to name them. Describe how nerve impulses are transmitted and explain why the reflex action is important. To be successful, you will be able to label the neurons in a reflex arc, explain why the reflex arc is important, and to know how to sort the order of a nerve impulse into the correct stages. So pause the video and try to write the stages of a reaction in order. You should remember this from the last video before I go over the answers. So first of all, you need a stimuli, so that could be a light, etc. And then you need your sensory receptors and your sense organs, so you need a senses. Then after that, you need your sensory neuron to pass the message from your senses to your CNS. And then you need your CNS, which sorts out the information. And then you need your motor neuron, which passes the information from your CNS to an effector. And your effector is like a muscle, etc., which then creates a response to your reaction. Well done if you managed to get all of that correct. If you didn't, then go watch the previous video. What happens when you stand on a nail or touch something hot? Do you think about moving your foot or hand away, or do you just automatically move it away? So you do, you automatically move it away, and this automatic protective movement is called a reflex action. So this works when a nerve impulse is carried towards the CNS by a sensory fiber nerve. It is carried to the muscle by a motor fiber, and if this action is involuntary, it is a reflex action. So this action does not necessarily involve the brain. Transmission of the nerve impulse through a reflex arc results in a reflex action. A reflex action is a rapid, automatic, involuntary response to a stimulus. Often the impulses only go to the spinal cord and the brain becomes aware of the action only after it has happened. So for example, a knee-jerk reaction or blinking or your iris changing size. Reflex actions protect parts of your body from serious damage. You need to remember that reflex actions are They are rapid, automatic and protective, and you would definitely write this in your jotter and highlight it. You should now be able to fill in the blanks with your previous knowledge, so pause the video and try to fill it in before we go over the answers. So the answers are that a reflex action is a rapid, involuntary response to a stimulus without the involvement of the brain, and reflex actions prevent the body from harm. The reflex arc involves 3 neurons. The 3 neurons are the sensory neuron, the interneuron, and the motor neuron. If you touch something painful, the receptors in the skin send an electrical impulse along the sensory neuron to the interneuron. Then this passes a signal to the motor neuron and onto the effector. This doesn't involve the brain until after the effector responds. So for example, if you touch a hot pan, your hand will automatically move away. You need to be able to label the different parts of the reflex arc, so you might be able to do some of this from your previous knowledge. So we need to first of all work out where the arrows are coming from. So the arrows are coming from this part here. So first of all, we know that firstly there needs to be a stimuli. So that could be a change in the environment like temperature change, etc. And then this needs to go to our receptors in our sense organs. So this is this bit here, which is our receptors. And then the first neuron that we know we come to should be our sensory neuron. And then our second neuron is the one that we've just learnt about for our reflex action, is our interneuron, and that is found in the CNS. And then the last neuron that we know is our motor neuron. So our motor neuron then takes the message to our last thing, which is our effector. And then our effector will make the response. So for example, a muscle contraction to move the arm away from a harmful stimuli. So as we said, receptor, sensory neuron, interneuron, motor neuron, and then effector, and then response. So well done if you managed to get any of that. Now you need to look and label and learn this diagram. So let's go over an example of our reflex action. So if somebody pricked you with a pin, your stimuli would be the pinprick, and it would be detected by the sensory receptors in your skin. So the pinprick is detected by your sense receptors in your sensory organ, which is the skin. And then we should know the next part. So this message will then get transmitted by the first neuron, which is always your sensory neuron. So your sensory neuron then carries these electrical impulses to your interneuron, and then your interneuron then receives the message, and then it'll pass it on to the motor neuron. So your motor neuron will then receive this message from the interneuron, and then it'll pass the electrical impulse to your effector, and then your effector will cause the response. So in this occasion, it'll be a muscle contraction, and your hand will pull away from the pinprick quickly, and that will protect your hand so that it doesn't get damaged by the pin, or there will be less damage. So this is a protective response. You should now be able to label A to E with your previous knowledge before I go over the answers. I will put up the word bank, but if you don't want to use the word bank, pause the video now. So here's the word bank. Right, so the answers are that A should be the stimulus acting on the sense receptor, B should be the sensory neuron, C the interneuron, and then D the motor neuron. Then E is the effector, which brings about a quick response. So you should have managed to get all that correct. If not, then you'll need to go back and watch the video again. The knee-jerk reflex is a reflex action which protects the body as it makes sure that you don't fall over. The knee-jerk reflex reaction is a very fast response where the muscle in the leg jerks up rapidly when you're tapped below the knee, and doctors use it to check your reflex actions. So the stimulus is sent from the sensory receptor to the sensory neuron and then to the motor neuron, which makes it extremely rapid. So there's no interneuron, so it just goes from sensory neuron to motor neuron, and it's extremely fast. So now you need to watch the video which tells you in detail about the reflex arc. So how does a reflex compare to a normal reaction? So first of all, there is a stimuli which is detected by the sensory neuron, which then sends the electrical impulse and message to the interneuron, which then sends the message to the motor neuron, which causes the effector to create a response. By not involving the conscious brain, the reflex action is quick and prevents a greater injury from occurring. Whereas a reaction goes from detecting the stimuli to the sensory neuron, then to the CNS where it is processed and sorted out, and then to the motor neuron where the effector triggers a response. It is therefore much slower than the reflex action. So well done if you managed to make them comparisons. So now you should be able to complete the activities below to review your learning. So doing the CNS past papers, the multicellular exam practice questions page 32 to 36, and getting 100% in the BBC bite-sized test after you've read through the revision page. You should now watch the video which summarises the nervous system, and you should do the testing your knowledge questions on page 82 and 86 of the National 5 James Torrance textbook and pause the video before I go over the answers. So the answers are that the brain and the spinal cord and nerves make up the nervous system. The brain and the spinal cord make up the CNS. The nervous system is for internal communication and coordination. The cerebrum is for learning and memory. The medulla controls the rate of breathing and heartbeat, and the cerebellum controls balance and muscular coordination. The transmission of a nerve impulse is detected by the sense organ, then goes to the sensory nerve, followed by the CNS, and then the motor nerve muscle. So can you make sure you've managed to get 100% in that? If not, then you need to watch the video again. You should now be able to pause the video and rewrite the sentences with the correct underlined choice before I go over the answers. So try to do that now. So the answers are: the environment stimuli are detected by receptors. Responses to nerve impulses are brought about by effectors. The first nerve cell in a reflex arc is called a sensory neuron. The final nerve in a reflex arc is called a motor neuron. An electrical impulse is transmitted towards the cell body of a neuron by a sensory fiber. An electrical impulse is carried away from the cell body of a neuron by an axon fiber. The gap between two neurons is called a synapse. A response made by a skeletal muscle is normally faster than that made by a gland. A rapid, automatic, involuntary response to a stimulus is called a reflex action. Well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then you need to go back and watch the videos. Let's now try to do some SQA questions. So the first question is to complete the flowchart and answer the question. So pause the video and try to complete it before I go over the answer. So the answer is that we've got our receptor, and then we should have our sensory neuron, then we should have our interneuron, and then we should have our motor neuron. And then it says describe the importance of a rapid reflex reaction in humans, and that would be because it is protective. So it protects the body from further harm. So let's try to answer the next question. So it says which letter shows the interneuron? Pause the video and try to answer it before I reveal the answer. So the answer should be B. So B shows the interneuron, and A would obviously be your sensory neuron, and C would be your motor neuron, and D would be your effector. So 3A. The diagram below represents the structures involved in a reflex action which occurs with a pain receptor in a human finger in stimulating. So let's try to answer 3A. So the diagram below represents the structures involved in a reflex action which occurs when a pain receptor in the human finger is stimulated. Complete the table below by adding the correct letters from the diagram to identify the stages of the reflex action. So try to put the correct letters in the table before I go over the answers. The answers are: first, when you've got a question that looks like this, you need to work out what is your stimulus. So your stimulus in this situation would be the fire, so that's what's going to cause the reaction. So then we need to work out where the receptors are going to take the message. So that would be our first letter, which is A. So electrical impulses pass along the sensory neuron, which would be A in this case. Then we've got our electrical impulses are sent along an interneuron, and we know that interneuron is always the second one, so in this case it must be B. And then we have got our electrical impulse pass along a motor neuron, and we always know that that comes next. So our motor neuron must then be this one, which is D. Then finally our effector organ, which makes our response, that is going to be F, which is going to be our effector. Well done if you managed to get all that correct. So the next question, try to name the gap between two neurons and then describe how information is passed across a gap between two neurons. So pause the video and try to do that. So the answer would be that the gap between the two neurons is the synapse, and the information is passed across the gap by chemicals that diffuse across the gap. You would have got it if you put neurotransmitters that diffuse across the gap, because it's the same thing. Well done if you managed to get that correct. Finally, the last question is, after a head injury, a student becomes dizzy and occasionally lost balance. Name the part of the brain which controls balance, and then to test if there was also damage to the spinal cord, Doctors touch different areas of the student's skin with a blunt needle. Describe how the stimulus is detected at the skin and how the message is then carried into and across the spinal cord. So pause the video and try to answer this yourself before I go over the answer. So the first answer is that the cerebellum is a part of the brain that controls balance. The second answer is that the stimulus is detected by receptors, which is sent by an electrical impulse to the sensory neuron. Then the sensory neuron sends the electrical impulse to the interneuron. This crosses the synapse between the two different neurons, and the message has to be carried by chemicals from one neuron to the other neuron, or you can say that neurotransmitters are released between the synapse of the both neurons. Then the message is passed to the motor neuron. So well done if you managed to get that correct. We have now come to the end of the lesson. So you should now be able to name the parts of the CNS, name the parts of the brain and describe their function, describe the roles of the sensory, inner and motor neurons, explain what reflex actions are, describe these actions using examples, know the electrical impulses move up neurons, know that the synapse is a gap between neurons that allows chemicals to transfer between neurons. Well done if you can confidently do all of the above things that I have just said. If you can't, then you need to watch the videos again. That is the end of this video tutorial. Woohoo! Thank you for listening.